I was just saying that how thrilled I am to be here with all of you, and I know Jane is too. We've been looking forward to this very much, and how thrilled I am to be doing this with Jane, because when I was a little girl, I used to look at Jane, and she was so glamorous, and she seemed to be doing such important things that I was rather in awe of her. And we rediscovered each other about 10 years ago and became firm friends, and I really treasure that friendship. And as Larry told you, she has powerful qualifications because she had these two uncles who both were in key positions just after the war. And certainly, my grandfather was really lucky to have her, and I think that she had a lovely time. And what I want to do today is to sort of ask Jane what it was like to be at 10 Downing Street and at Hyde Park Gate with my grandfather, because I think that she has a story to tell, which, we can have any number of historians, but she was there.
Thank you, Celia. Sorry, can you hear?
You have to put it down your throat, I think.
Like that. Can you hear now? Yeah. I want to say, first of all, I'm so honoured to be here with such wonderful people, all of whom we all have the same interest and love of the greatest man who ever lived, Winston Churchill. And also, but particularly Celia, I'm so indebted to you, not just for friendship, but for allowing me the opportunities to talk about your wonderful grandfather. And I remember you so well when I was first there, the whole way through the 6 years I was with Churchill, which was from 1949 to 55, as Larry said. We used to see Celia running in the garden. You were about 6 or 7 years old. And Churchill used to call her my little redhead. And he loved her. And they were up and down to the room at Chartwell, and also Hyde Park Gate and Downing Street. So we've known each other a long time, but as Celia said, our friendship has grown. Maybe, would it be a good idea if I just said how I came to work?
Absolutely, I think
Yes.
It'd be very good.
My Uncle Rab, with whom I lived, I'd done a secretarial course, and the Conservative Party, as you all know, was in opposition, and Rab was busy forming the next policy for they were certain would be another Conservative government. And he came back to where we lived one evening and said to me, I've just been with Winston, and I was in the office, and they're crying out for another secretary. He was at that point on the 4th volume of the history of the Second World War, which Larry knows so well. And so the head secretary said, we just can't cope with his input of work. He was a relentless worker, and round the clock. And they said, we need someone young and strong to do the night work. And Rab said to me, why don't you have a go? I was 18, had a child of the war already, but we had listened to Churchill on his radio broadcasts throughout the war, and he was an icon. I mean, to imagine I'd ever set eyes on Winston Churchill was impossible to think of. And so, anyway, I got into my best dress and rang up Hyde Park Gate, and they said, yes, come along for an interview. You'll be interviewed by Mr. Churchill. Gosh, I got frightened. And I went along to Hyde Park Gate, and it was after lunch, and there were two houses at Hyde Park Gate with an intersecting passage, and the family lived in one house and the office was in the other house. And as I stood at one end of the passage between the two houses, suddenly I see Winston Churchill standing at the other end of the passage. He's dressed for the House of Commons in his striped trousers and waistcoat, and he walks towards me, smiling, holds out his hand, shakes my hand, walks round me, shakes my hand, and walks away. And Joe Sturdy, the head secretary, said, "Well, that's all right. When can you begin?" So, I mean, think of the disgrace of that sort of interview nowadays. And so I said Monday, and I was there on Monday, and I was there for 6 years. And there were two, am I going on too long?
No.
There were two elections, of course. 1950, the Labour Party returned with a majority of 6 seats. Nobody can cover with 6 seats majority. And Churchill, who was at that point, and for the rest of his life, obsessed with his feeling that it was for him to bring peace to the Western democracy again, and bring peace with the Soviet communism of Russia. And he'd known Stalin, talked to him in the war, got on with him, so it was believed. And so that this was his obsession. And so he was determined to be a peacetime prime minister. And you know, people think of Churchill as the great warmonger. He was a peacemaker. He fought wars for the sake of peace. And so that he then knew he would be prime minister. He was convinced he would. And 18 months later, indeed, the Conservatives won another election, and with a majority of 26, not very many. And he was on his way to Buckingham Palace to see the Queen, to shake hands, and to move to Downing Street. And he took two of us, Elizabeth Gilliard and myself, with him to Downing Street. And we worked, the Churchills had the flat, the Prime Minister's, it's all different now, but the Prime Minister's flat was at the top of the house. Churchill had a big bedroom overlooking Horse Guards Parade, where he would work, as we all know, he worked in bed, this great bed, in his brocade dressing gown. People would come to see him there in the mornings. Cabinet ministers, anybody would be shown up to his bedroom. And he would have the cat on one end of the bed and the dog, poodle, Rufus on the other end, and a budgerigar flying around. And he would get on with his work. And so it went on. In the afternoons, twice a week, he'd go to question time in the House of Commons. And that was not the aggravated, fierce question time we all know about now. This was a time of, he loved question time. And it was a time for wit and getting on with everybody. Think how different the world might be if that happened now. And so we'd work in his room in the House of Commons. And he'd have an hour's nap or something during the day. And then, this was Monday to Thursday. And then he'd go to Chartwell. And when he was Prime Minister, of course, he was expected to go to Chequers. But he made an arrangement because, as you all know, and Celia knows better than anyone, he loved Chartwell more than anywhere in the world. He was at peace at Chartwell. And he knew then he could get on with his work. He was still, those first 2 years, he was still finishing the war memoirs, which Larry knows so well. And after dinner at Chartwell, the dining room in those days, you've been to Chartwell today, I know, and the dining room is in the basement now, as it worked. In those days, it was just along the passage from his study. And so he would, I always remember, I would have a table in the corner with my typewriter on it. He would come in after dinner about 10:30 in his siren suit, and he'd be murmuring to himself, murmuring the words he was going to dictate. And he'd walk up and down the study and dictate to me on the typewriter. And in those days, you see, you had to have carbon copies and everything. You had to make copies. So I'd get that ready. And then in those days also, there was a radiogram in the corner. And he would have playing music hall songs or war songs. And I had to know as I typed, and he spoke. And he'd be deep into his speaking that I must get up, turn over the 6 records you put on the radio. So that was worrying. And so I used to put on as number 6, because it was one of my favourites, a record that went, and she was an admiral's daughter, but her bathing suit never got wet. And so I knew when we got to that, I'd jump up, turn them over, back to my typewriter, and there'd be a gap. But he knew. He never said to me, why is this gap here? He'd fill it in with his own handwriting. And then the proofs would go every day. By the end of the day, there's this wonderful word about 2 o'clock in the morning, soup. And he would drink a bowl of consommé. And that meant it was the end of the working day. He'd go to bed. And I would put the proofs by the front door. When I come to think of it, to think the front door was left open. And the driver would arrive at 7 o'clock the next morning, take it to the station, and the proofs would be back that evening. And he would settle down and correct them. And so that was the way the history got written. And later, when he was Prime Minister, he'd be dictating speeches for the House. So that was how I came to work for him, to work day and night. And it's so true that we all loved him. There was nothing that he asked of us that was too much, night or day. And of course he never asked more than he was giving himself. And we were aware of that. And we never resented it for a moment. And we all got on with each other, and it was a very happy working arrangement.
But Jane, sorry, when I was growing up, the one thing he always used to say to us, that we must never let the sun go down on our quarrels.
Yeah.
And we used to always say sorry and make up. And I think he was a bit like that, wasn't he? If he upset someone, he always said sorry.
Well, the thing was, patience was a virtue with which he had no acquaintance at all. And so there would be the most terrible upsets and shouting and sometimes even throwing the pen across the room or something. And I used to just get out of the room. And he never apologized. And I am so pleased that he didn't apologize. That would have spoiled everything. Because it was nearly always because I'd forgotten something. But as Celia said so truly, by the end of the day, there'd be a gesture. It was usually a smile. And that smile, Celia, you remember so well. You got it, actually. But it was so magical, and that would be good enough. And so that was, you're quite right. the sun didn't go down without the smile.
But do you remember what happened when King George VI died?
Yes. Now, I'd love to have my bag. I'm so sorry, just something I need. I should have brought it with me. No, that one. Thank you.
A lady with many bags.
Thank you.
You'll be called
Sorry.
a bag lady.
A bag lady. Thank you, sir. But George VI died. Sorry, can you hear? George VI died in February 1952. And the young queen was in Kenya, maybe you call it Kenya, Celia does.
Well, only because I lived there, but of course it's Kenya now.
The young queen came back from Kenya with Prince Philip, and Churchill was to broadcast to the nation at night. And he had not nearly finished his dictation because he was so meticulous with his work, whether it was a radio broadcast, whatever it was. He would be so much time would be spent getting it right and correcting it. And he said, I haven't finished yet, and so I need to take you in the car to what was then London Airport, where the Queen came back. And I remember he dictated the whole way. And the other thing that maybe you know, Churchill was a romantic. He was so wonderfully kind-hearted, and he loved the Queen, and who he already knew. And he was determined to make it good. And so we drove in the car, and as happened quite often, he wept. And I have never known anybody who wept so beautifully as Winston Churchill. You know, so often when I cry, for instance, it's a horror story. But tears just poured down his face, and he'd be quite still sometimes. And in the car, as he went, he wept. And yes, and I've written this down because I remember it so well, that dictation in the car to London Airport. And I think this is just so beautiful. He dictated, during these last months, the king walked with death, as if death were a companion, an acquaintance whom he recognized and did not fear. In the end, death came as a friend. And after a happy day of sport and sunshine, and after saying goodbye to those who loved him, he fell asleep as every man and woman who strives to fear God and nothing else in the world may hope to do. And he dictated those words in the car, weeping. We got to London Airport, and the plane had drawn up. And there's a wonderful photograph, which I'm sure you know, of Churchill with his cabinet. He's at the top of the row, but it's the back view, by the steps of the airplane. And the cabinet, the broad figure of Winston Churchill, the new Prime Minister. Next to him, the elegance of Anthony Eden, and then so on down the whole cabinet. And as I looked out of the window when we arrived, I saw Anthony Eden's private secretary, who was called Evelyn Shuckburgh, wonderful man. And Evelyn said to me, "This is history, we've got to watch it." And I got out and we knelt behind the wheels of a plane just nearby. And I remember seeing this beautiful young girl, she was 25 years old, in her slim, the Queen, standing at the top of the aeroplane steps, ready to greet her cabinet. And she greeted the cabinet and we drove back to London. The broadcast was absolutely wonderful. And that was February 1952. And then, of course, there was the coronation the next year. In May 1953 was the coronation. And Churchill, Anthony Eden by then was desperately ill and was in the States having medical treatment. So Churchill, he decided he'd take over the Foreign Office. And there was one point he said, I think I'll go and work from the Foreign Office. The Foreign Office didn't really like the idea of that. So we stayed at number 10. And there was the coronation. And after the coronation, he was tired. He was so tired with all the panoply of it all. And he had this stroke.
Well, that was an extraordinary thing, wasn't it? When they managed to pull the wool over everyone's eyes.
I know. I mean, that couldn't possibly happen now. But it was decided with a very select few people. Of course, Jock Colville wrote to the Queen immediately. And he said the monarch was informed. And also, this is what was so clever, really. His best friends, who were the newspaper proprietors, they were informed. And he said, I have not finished the job I was given to do to bring peace to the world. And I'm going to keep quiet about it. This is to be kept quiet. And Anthony Eden knew, Rab Butler knew, the cabinet didn't know, and the chairman of the cabinet knew, the secretary of the cabinet, Norman Brooke, knew. Otherwise, nobody knew. The family knew. You knew, Celia.
Well,
Did you know Grandpa was?
Well, we knew there was a lot of drama and upset going on, and everyone was on tenterhooks. So I did know. I do remember it being people talking in hushed whispers and thinking something dreadful was happening.
Well, it was dreadful because it was a very serious stroke. And he was a very, very serious stroke. But he was coherent, and he had, his mind was completely clear. The stroke happened on a Tuesday night. He went to the cabinet the next morning on Wednesday. And my Uncle Rab told me nobody noticed that anything was wrong, except they thought the Prime Minister's very quiet today. And then he went straight up to his room and he said, I'm going to Chartwell, which was where he would be happy, you know. All the doctors had come to see him and they said, this is very serious. And whether he recovers or not is in the balance. He went down to Chartwell that Thursday, and I went in the police car behind and set up the office, because we had to, and Jock Colville was very much there, we had to pretend that nothing wrong was happening.
Didn't everyone say he was exhausted? Wasn't that the story?
The medical people, the doctors, issued a statement saying that he needed a month's rest. It had been too strenuous, the coronation festivities. So that I was there the whole time. He was there at Chartwell for 2.5 months. To begin with, his speech became totally slurred, and his left arm, he couldn't move his left arm. He was in his bedroom. I didn't know at Chartwell, I don't think they open up the bedroom. You don't go into the bedroom. It's just beyond the study. And so he was in his bedroom. But he was never once during that whole period did I ever hear him complain or grumble or feel sorry for himself. And he was seriously ill. But he had nurses, and they would put him in a wheelchair and wheel him to the dining room for meals where the family would gather. And he would come back to his bed, and Jock Colvin and I set up a reading table. And he would read classical books. He loved Trollope. And I remember he couldn't turn the pages, you see. So I remember sitting sometimes for an hour and a half, just looking at this wonderful face, this wonderful person. And when he got to the end of the page, he'd blink, and I'd turn the page. And Jock shared this with me. And so that he was very, in a way, at peace with that. And the black boxes, the government motor bicycles came down with all the government papers, and they piled up, and they were dealt with by Jock Colville and by his son-in-law, Christopher Soames. And nobody guessed. I mean, that is what is so extraordinary.
It's scandalous, isn't it, really? Now you think, if that happened now, my
Well,
God.
you couldn't do it now.
You couldn't do it now, no.
You see, in those days, it's a different world to everybody in this room. There was no such thing as a mobile phone. There was nothing except conversation, and there were telephones. So that was how the stroke progressed, and he got better the whole time. And by August, the stroke had happened the 23rd of June. By August, he was able to go back to the cabinet room, back to number 10, and he took a cabinet meeting. And still nobody guessed. And then he went to see the Queen at Balmoral, and just for 24 hours. And then he went down to the south of France to Lord Beaverbrook's house there, which he loved, which you know, Celia, Cappuccina. And he stayed there for till by then he had another goal, which was the Conservative Party conference, annual conference, which was to take place in October in Margate. And he was determined to prove himself to his party.
Didn't he say that if I can do that, then I can stay on?
Yes, exactly, Celia. He said, exactly those words. And so there would be copy after copy after copy. He was writing this wonderful speech to the Conservative Party conference. And in fact, I'm getting to the end of my piece, and then I want to, because then after Margate, it was a huge success. The whole room rose to their feet, cheering, and I was sitting in the audience correcting the proof, because that's why the archives are so wonderful, because all these proofs were corrected by hand as he spoke by one of us. And it was the old Churchill, it was the orator, it was the wit, it was the purpose. And he then had proved himself there. And he, at that point, after that, he stayed on for a little bit, and then he went back to Choctaw, really, on the whole. He was travelling, and that was where Celia travelled with him the whole time, on Onassis' yacht, and he was writing his history of the English-speaking peoples. So he never stopped, almost till the day he died. I wasn't there, but you must.
Well, he always went on, and what he really liked doing was painting. I mean, his
Yes.
greatest solace was the wonderful painting that he could do. He loved that. He really loved that. But it was, I mean, I was very lucky because I was just an available grandchild of a suitable age to travel with him in the end of his life. Yep. But we did have this incredible cruise on the Christina, where we went from Monte Carlo to Istanbul and back on a very sort of dramatic cruise, because the other guests were Maria Callas and her husband. And so we had this incredible thing, and I was not yet 16. And so I was watching this extraordinary thing going on in front of my eyes, this romance between Onassis and Callas in front of her husband and his wife. And it was the sort of thing I could only read about in the magazines that were considered unsuitable. So I was absolutely transfixed. All the grown-ups were absolutely horrified, but I was enchanted because I was having a lot of fun and it was very entertaining. Not to mention there was a very glamorous tutor for the Onassis children who I really fancied. But by the end of the cruise, the marriage was over. But for the time of the cruise, everything had to go on as normal, and it was quite extraordinary. But my grandfather would sit there, and Callas, we all hated Callas, and she used to try and feed him ice cream from her with her spoon, and he was perfectly capable of feeding himself. And she was horrified one day when we arrived at Epidaurus, at this incredible amphitheatre, which was piled high with flowers, and they were in the shape of a V. So this was really her natural habitat. She'd sung there many times. She turned to my mother and she said, "Oh, Diana, what beautiful flowers. What kind people. But why do you think they're in the shape of a V?" And the look on her face when my mother said, "Because, Maria, they're not for you, they're for Papa." But I did some wonderful, I spent a lot of time within the south of France, was also really lovely. And on one occasion, we had this drama when he broke his hip. And he fell in his room and he broke his hip. And there was just him and Anthony Montague Brown and me there. And so Anthony and I walked to the hospital. And he said, "You know, Celia, he's not going to make it." So we got into his room, and it seemed as all the medical staff of the hospital had congregated there on a sort of sightseeing tour. So he looked around the room. He looked incredibly frail, but he gathered the strength to dismiss all the medical staff and turned to Anthony and said, "I want to die in England. You'll make this happen, won't you?" And he didn't get an immediate reply. Of course, I knew, because I knew what Anthony had just said to me before. And so he said, "Promise me." So Anthony said, "Yes, I promise." But as we walked back to the hotel, he said, "That's a promise I'm not going to be able to keep." But he made a call to Harold Macmillan, who was the Prime Minister at the time, and an RAF VC-10 ambulance plane was ordered to come and collect him and take him home. So the next morning he was loaded onto a stretcher bed, which was wheeled onto the lift, you call it the elevator, that would take the food up to the aeroplane. And he was taken up on that and then placed in the stripped down body of the aircraft. And they gave me a chair and I sat next to him, and all I could do was hope and pray that he would make it. We got to Heathrow and he again was put out on the elevator. And as he was lowered slowly down to the ground, he spotted a little group of airport workers who were absolutely ashen-faced, the colour of these tablecloths. And he seemed to get a burst of adrenaline. He looked, he smiled, he gave them a V sign. They all clapped, and we knew he was going to be all right. He was all right, but never quite the same again.
Because Celia is the only, well, later when he died, you were the only grandchild there.
No, Winston was there.
Oh, Winston was there.
Yeah.
But at those last days.
No, it was extraordinary. But you told us about the cat on the bed.
Yes.
And I remember well, I used to love going to see him having his breakfast in bed in the morning.
Yes.
And there would be the cat snuggled up, the newspaper strewn over the bed, and very likely a secretary taking dictation. Might have been you.
Might have been me.
And Rufus would run around, and the budgerigar would swoop in to get a titbit or two. And when after he'd had his stroke, he was unconscious really for 10 days. And every day I would go to see him, and the cat would be snuggled up beside him, and it seemed 10 long days that cat never seemed to move. But it was an extraordinarily faithful cat, I think. But it was a terrible time. It was absolutely extraordinary. And
the crowds had all gathered outside, hadn't they?
well, the crowds gathered outside, and then eventually they were moved up to the end of the street. But it was extraordinary going to see him. And the extraordinary thing was that a few years before he'd told, I think it was Jock, was it?
Yes.
That he was going to die on the anniversary of his
Yes.
father, Lord Randolph's death. So, you know, we knew this, but we couldn't really take it seriously. But I believe that people, they used to ring from Buckingham Palace, and Anthony Montagu Brown would answer the phone. And they'd say, well, what's happening? How is he? You know, the sort of way people ask, how is someone? Meaning, you know, because they had a lot of things to be put into action, as everyone knew he was going to die. And so he said, oh, he won't die yet. He won't die he's going to die on the 24th of January. And in Buckingham Palace, they must have thought he was quite mad. Anyway, on the morning of the 24th of January in 1965, we gathered round his bed, and 70 years to the day, and probably to the minute, because no one recorded the minute when Lord Randolph died, his son slipped imperceptibly away to meet his maker. It was an extraordinary thing. And for me, I'd always been rather scared of dying, but it removed all fear of death from me because it was just such a peaceful thing. So I've got that to thank him for too.
And then the funeral.
Well, the funeral was amazing, wasn't it? The funeral was something, yes. Well, we were both there.
Yeah, well, you were there as the family.
But it was quite extraordinary. It was an extraordinary day, and it was such a day that I didn't, you know, we were all going through it as though we were acting in a play. Mm-hmm. And my sister and I were in the carriage behind my grandmother and my two aunts. And we'd had an incident a few years before when we were much younger, when we'd been taken to a window under Big Ben when Queen Mary, the Queen's grandmother, had died, and she was taken to lie in state, and we were placed in a window. And obviously our parents thought we were terribly well behaved, so they left us there without any instructions what to do. The next morning there was a photograph in the newspaper of two little girls roaring with laughter over the top of the coffin. So when we got into our carriage, we said we'd better not talk to each other because it's difficult to talk to someone who you're fond of without showing some animation. So we held each other's hands and squeezed them occasionally, but we didn't say a word for the whole journey. But it was an extraordinary day. But only when I got home in the evening and turned on the television, I got the whole import of the day from a different angle, because you could see what was happening, because we couldn't see what was happening because we were in it. But Jane, thanks so much. It's lovely doing this with you. It's so much fun.
It's so much fun for me. And so thank you.
And thank you, Larry, very much. And thank you, Larry, for producing all those wonderful companion volumes and all that you do in my grandfather's name.